Pat, please. But I'll also like verbally ask for one. So that's cool. Beginning in 3, 2, 1. In the world as it is now, there are plenty of people who have strong political opinions. The problem is that those strong political opinions do not necessarily align particularly well with the political opinions of a political party. Instead, it is very largely in opposition to a specific political party. And there is very little that you can do from that position to meaningfully express your own political belief and therefore have that be meaningfully represented in government. From OG, we think that negative voting is a very simple solution. It means that people can now more effectively communicate their political ideals. It means that governments are much more representative, and it allows for the worst aspects of party politics to be reined in and moderated substantially. So in terms of modeling, I think that this is very straightforward. You on your ballot would simply indicate what type of vote you are inputting, and just, ballots are often able to be incredibly clear as to what it is that this means. We would ensure voters go through substantial education through public news media to be able to ensure that this is something they are very, very familiar with. I can't imagine that this is particularly difficult in that regard. Two arguments from OP. First, on the principle. I want to first of all explain why the principle in this debate is largely important and cannot be run away from outside of just teams trying to talk about pragmatics. The principle is important in this debate for a number of reasons. First of all, it is because the way that we count votes is integral to how it is that governments are determined, right? Who is actually in power and the decisions that they made is based on which votes are counted, how they are counted, who is collecting them, and also who even feels the need to go out to vote in the first place. Meaning that all consequentialist arguments are dependent on this being a reasonably fair and accessible way for people to communicate their political ideals. The second reason why it is that this is important is because when we have governments that are representative of the will of the people, it means that we have much more accountable governments, right? In status quo, it is on both sides of the house difficult to make sure that governments are able to be held to account because there's very little information that the vote tells us outside of just a preference for one party over another. What this means is that it's difficult for mandates to be held accountable because there's a very wide interpretation as to why you voted for one party over another. This means that the more type of data that we're able to collect about the impressions that people have of political parties, about what they are seemingly liking and disliking about the way that the world is going, the more easy it is to then come to decisions about how parties can be held accountable by their own populations. Thus, I want to explain why it is that this principle is actually something that matters and how it is that it's true. So this is a very legitimate political opinion to have. Why is this? I think that the first reason is just rather intuitive, that there are many instances in which you have political parties that you don't necessarily like around you, and that you find it morally questionable to vote for any of the parties who have a reasonable chance in your area. For example, in multi-party democracies, where, say, for example, there are 3 political parties that are reasonably popular where you live, the first party might have a history of corruption, the other 2 parties might be wildly differing from what your ideal political opinions are. What happens in status quo is that you have no option in terms of who you should vote for. Either you end up voting for a political party that you find is outright corrupt, and therefore you just continually support bad outcomes in that regard, or you vote for parties that are just completely disjointed from your actual political opinions, and as a result, you just don't have a meaningful say in politics. The consequence of this in most circumstances is that people feel alienated from the vote and don't participate in their own democracy because they don't see that there's a valuable way for their voice to be heard. And notably, external things like advocacy or whatever not only are still possible under both sides of the house, but don't do substantially enough work to be able to actually express that opinion. This is a legitimate view because it allows people who previously don't have a way to communicate their expression of dislike for a particular party to actually express that. The second issue that exists is that in a lot of instances, people then have to do proxy voting or strategic voting. What this means is that, say, for example, there's a party that they think is likely to win, but they strongly, strongly dislike it and do not want it to win. What happens in a lot of circumstances is that those individuals then have to do massive amounts of research into looking up which party is most likely to be in second place currently to take that particular seat. So say the Conservatives are very, very likely to win in your area. You then have to find which of the 3 other parties in your area might have a reasonable chance of beating them, and then choose which one you think is most likely and try to coordinate that others make that exact same decision to vote for that party. I would just argue that this is an incredibly high barrier to entry, which means that a lot of people don't find much of a need of engaging in politics. And as well, it falls very susceptible to the very same things I previously outlined of just parties being morally dubious and thus people don't want to vote for them. The through line of this is that there's many instances in status quo wherein people have legitimate political opinions that are not able to be represented exclusively through positive voting. And as a result, as a result, they distance themselves from voting and do not participate in elections. And there's less information for us to be able to understand how government should be formed. Conversely, under our side of the house, this introduces ways for people to actually be involved directly at the ballot box, which is a good thing, not only because we have more representative governments, but because it also establishes much more of a formal process of elections, meaning that people are just more engaged in their own political system because they are actually going out to vote. People are more informed because they're actually going out to vote. And people as well just are better educated about their political system. And there's more infrastructure for voting because there's more people who are actually going about doing it. Thus, we think that this is on itself something that should be implemented. The second thing that I want to talk about is the moderation of extreme political opinions. But before I do, closing if you have anything. Cool, continuing. Why is it that this moderates extreme behavior? What is the problem in status quo? Well, you can be an extremist party and do your own political calculations and recognize that you have enough positive votes going your way that you don't really care about alienating others. Opposition is going to claim that there's always an incentive for you to be having general appeal to the wider population. But this actually isn't true. In a lot of circumstances, you have an incentive to, for example, be very aggressive and very extreme in how it is that you frame your political opinions. So that way you can try to galvanize support from your more extremist fan bases and get them to line up and vote for you because you are using rhetoric that is very inflammatory and motivates them to be able to vote. This is a bad thing though, right? Why? First of all, because extremist rhetoric on its own means that a lot of extremists participate in politics and you get much more of a desire for extreme policy. The second reason why it's bad is because it's inherently marginalizing, right? The more that you use extremist and divisive rhetoric, the more people feel themselves the targets of violence as a result of the world politic that they exist in, because they feel that their own lives are inherently at debate and are much more in question. Why is it that this actually forms to moderate? Well, because even if you are in a safe riding and you would typically win by a considerable landslide, you now are at risk because even if the parties around you aren't particularly strong and don't have a chance of winning, you could now literally receive 20,000 negative votes, which could literally mean the difference between your ability to win an election or not win an election because of how much your divisiveness has literally pushed people away. It means more fringe extreme parties potentially don't meet 5% thresholds to get state funding for future elections, meaning that you don't have as much of an incentive to feed extremist fan base to try to get positive votes, and instead you try to run away from that, so that way you can actually still have some sort of widespread support. How to propose?
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech, and now welcome the Leader of Opposition.
Am I audible? Great. Here I have 5 minutes, hopefully closing. 3, 2, 1. Now, one quick piece of framing and then 2 arguments. Firstly, on how you radically change the focus of campaigns on their side of the house. Second, on how this tangibly changes how people vote and why that's likely to be bad. The first piece of framing is that I posit politicians are already held accountable in a litany of manners. And I think this engages with their extremism argument, right? Because look, I think you can do things such as impeachment, such as re-elections on our side of the house. This motion probably is placed in Western liberal democracies second, at the point in which most of them have term limits, even if therefore people in offices have incentives to do bad things, i.e. nobody is voting for Trump anymore after the storming of Capitol Hill for the same reasons as to why it is probably true that they don't want really bad politicians or really bad presidents in office if it is a consensus that the entirety of the country already hates these types of people and are willing to wash them out already. First argument, how you change the focus of campaigns, because I think it is probably true that politicians opt more for smear campaigns than they do for actually creating positive material on their side of the house. The first burden that we want to fill is that people are more likely to push for negative votes as a trade-off to them otherwise doing conventional votes. Why is this the case? Because first, I think it is more convenient for politicians to push these things insofar as instituting positive and constructive policy often takes lots of amounts of effort, and there's lots of amounts of long-term risks that they have to internalize and they have to reckon with. And this happens in 2 ways. First, whether or not the policy actually leads to good outcomes, at the point in which these good outcomes are contingent on arbitrary things, i.e. whether or not people receive them well, whether or not you're able to get enough funding, whether or not you're able to pass particular bureaucratic hurdles, yet the opportunity cost for these things is incredibly high. Because when you're in office and you are looking for re-election, pushing for those types of long-term change oftentimes takes lots of capital for you to be able to do this. Oftentimes takes lots of uncertainty as to whether or not people are going to opt into those policies. But second, I just think like you need a brain to push positive and constructive policy, right? I think at the point in which many politicians are lazy and silver spoon and typically tend to side with particular voter blocks that they already think are predisposed to voting for them, there's less of an incentive for them to be able to go out and do those types of things by making those risks. But second, I think there's also a race to the bottom with media coverage, and it shifts more into negative aspects because they're more likely to drum up views. It looks like scandals rather than legitimate political things. Why is it the case? Because first, I think there's a larger shock factor at the point in which people are risk averse and do not like the idea of a molester in the White House and will do things such as trying to ban those particular instances. But second, people want to pin blame so that it appears as if they are granted security because the media say, aha, Bill Clinton was solely responsible for the 2008 financial crisis. Probably makes people feel a sense of security if Bill Clinton is being repetitively shat on and being given some sort of guarantee that they won't be voted into office in the future, right? I think these are reasons as to why, first, these instances of scandal are likely to be disproportionately blown up. But second, I think at the point in which this happens, this makes politicians far this incentivizes politicians to not necessarily build on to pile up on these things rather than do constructive policy making, as we've already told you. What is the comparative here? Because look, first, I think even if it is true that incentives to cater to party politics still exist, the problem is you have to push for constructive material on our side of the house rather than get one politician singled out. Because if you are a party or if you are a media outlet that is trying to do this, the problem is there are lots of other politicians who may be front runners or who may also have some sort of allegiance to the party, and you also have to fathom with the possibility of them being able to take over. So it's feasibly not possible for you to just bank on one politician or load all your ammo on one person if there are also other people that could take them in their place on our side of the house. But second, I think you don't have people therefore trying to shift the limelight onto one politician because there's a potentiality of other politicians winning votes. What this means is that one, you get far more diversity of voices on our side of the house. Because look, even if there are legitimate reasons to cancel somebody, and this takes OG at their best, this prompts a reactionary incentive from the other party to also single out another one out and cancel them, because if one politician has negative 2,000 votes, they probably also want the other front runner to have negative 2,000 votes. Otherwise, the other front runner will be winning, right? So even in their best case, and even if the incentives are good for them to do this, I think at the point to which campaigns become much more situated on two people and their most extreme views, this takes out other politicians who otherwise would have had the media limelight to be able to share their other views. It looks like things such as the Green Party, which already are not getting much represented in media, but I think those impacts compound on their side of the house. But the second subpoint under this is that there's a shift to no impact centricism. The reason for this is that nobody wants to be singled out anymore at the point in which the opportunity cost for getting bashed on is far greater. This exists not only in terms of votes, but also in the negative publicity that you get when opposing party media shits on you. But here's the issue. The only way in which you get progressive change is if these things are proposed in the first place, right? This means that the Bernie Sanders and the AOCs of the world never run for office positions because they don't think they could get anything. This means that senators in lower offices also stop pushing for radical or progressive policy because it will hurt the re-election of career advancement to be associated with such, right? Before I move on, CG.
Look, I hate to be the why is this a unique tipping point guy, but parties already do attack ads under status quo. Why is this a unique tipping point?
I already explained this, right? On their side, there's much more incentive to pile on one person, and that's likely to be bad in comparison to on our side. Like, they're not willing to do this because there could be other people that take their place. I've already explained this. But here's the issue, and here this engages with OG. Because one, they say there's a race to extremism. I think the nuance here is there are also good and bad instances of extremism. In the instance where there's good extremism or good progressivism, I think being radical to some extent is a prerequisite for you to get actual change, because every ideal that we see as progressive or somewhat leftward facing on our side of the house now was somewhat considered as radical in the past. I.e., this looks like things such as same-sex marriage in Taiwan. So at the point to which lots of people are risk averse, and at the point to which nobody therefore wants to bring these things up in policy anymore, that is the tipping point to which you no longer get these voices or these ideas heard in the first place. Getting these ideas is a prerequisite to policy actually being passed. But second, I think if Goff wants to talk about bad extremism, I think bad extremism as a wash at the point to which this probably looks like catering to very small subsets of really radical and harmful people, at the point to which the vast majority of people don't agree with these policies anyways, they don't get voted in. But I think but second, I think the way this works is this also outweighs the principle, right? Because look, people don't run in the first place if they believe that they're going to get crowded out by race to the bottom, right? So even if this is the case on their side of the house, if we buy OG's best, that these are lots of bad people who you don't like and you ought be able to be representative in downvoting one of them, I think if people don't run in the first first place because there is no impact centrism in the counterfactual because they want to avoid all of this land blasting. If this is the case, you also alienate people who otherwise would have come vote. What this means is that the principle is incredibly dubious. When at worst it is a flip, when at best it is dubious because this also trades off of some people getting less representation when less people show up on the ballot box and when you're able to fill in less preferences. But at worst, it's a flip, right? Because having preferences or having these voices in politics or people that you are able to vote for is a prerequisite to actually filling your autonomous desires. Because when you are a gay person or when you are a gender minority and you don't see anybody on the ballot box that you could potentially vote for, even if you downvote those people, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're able to actually get the policies that you want passed to be passed if nobody's campaigning for those things in the first place. But second, this changes how people vote because this allows for more identity politics to dominate the domain because this considers how the mentality changes, right? You yourself no longer ask yourself, who do I want to be in office? Rather, who do I not want to be in office? That's also quite bad. Very proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the Leader of Opposition for that fine speech and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Alrighty, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Fantastic. I'll call for a PY roughly halfway through from back half. If they don't have one, I will take one from top half. Okay. Three, two, one. Yes, we will lose out on some left-wing extremism, but we will also lose out on a lot of right-wing extremism. And it is more important to get right-wing extremists out of power than it is to ensure that left-wing extremists get into power for all the reasons that Ethan gave you and more that I'll give you in this speech. Let's start with some comprehensive rebuttal. Their main point is that if we pass this motion, there's going to be more, the focus of campaigns is going to shift towards smears and towards negative attacks on others. This is simply untrue. Why? Because if you're a politician or a party and you spend all your time and energy just smearing your opponent, going after them, attacking them, making people hate them, now voters are significantly more likely to just negative vote that other party rather than voting for you. And for you to get in power, you need people to like you. So what this actually does is flip the incentives, and it means more of an incentive for you to be good, to look good, rather than just seeming better than the alternative. And so this means more constructive actions, more constructive policymaking of all the types that they described. But also, even if this isn't true, I posit, as CG agrees in the POI, this is largely symmetric. On both sides of the House, politicians have enormous incentives to demonize the other side, given the increased polarization that we have seen. We would posit that this polarization is the underlying cause of smear campaigns, and insofar as we can show that over time we are going to reduce this polarization by ending up at, maybe sure, in our worst case, milquetoast centrism, then we also get the benefits of less smearing. On the whole scandals point, I think this is even more symmetric. Like, on both sides, the news media has incentives to glamorize, to focus on what's most sensationalistic. Sex sells, we all know that. There's a reason why people spent an entire year on the Bill Clinton-Monica Lewinsky scandal. But also, even if you don't buy any of that, I think we can very easily outweigh this with the stuff I'm going to give you later on extremism. Yes, maybe it's not great, even their best case, if they show that they get slightly meaner campaigns, but if we ensure that democracies are healthy and vibrant and ensure that minorities have basic human rights, obviously that outweighs that. Let's now engage with this point on the shift towards centrism, because they basically can see that this is what's going to happen, but they only focus on the less progressivism side of things. So now I'll do what I said I would do in my introduction. So it is way, way more important to keep right-wing extremists out of power than to allow left-wing extremists into power. What are the reasons for this? First, typically speaking, as we've seen time and time again with right-wing populists in America, in Europe, around the world, they tend to go after democratic institutions in a way that is way more dangerous than left-wing extremists who tend not to do this that much. Typically speaking, left-wing extremists are just nicer people who don't sort of attack constitutions, who don't try to set themselves up in power like Trump with January 6th, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so when a right-wing extremist gets in power, there's a risk of them actually seizing power undemocratically and then staying in power for a really long time. Whereas when a left-wing extremist gets into power, they're less likely to do this. And so eventually they'll get voted out and we'll return to more normalcy. And given that extremist parties never stay in power for that long, if they are indeed past the Overton window of what the average voter wants. Second reason why it's so important for us to get right-wing extremists out, even if it comes at the expense of left-wing extremists. Simply put, even if left-wing extremists have better incentives, in other words, even if they have great incentives, even if they want to do awesome stuff for the world, they have to work within the system. They have to work within our neoliberal economic structures. They have to work within our neoliberal political structures. They have to accommodate the IMF. They have to sort of work with sort of banks worldwide to get funding for their governments, yada, yada, yada. And so there's roadblock after roadblock after roadblock that keeps them from achieving what they would want to achieve, which is to say broad-scale socioeconomic equality. By contrast, right-wingers, they are working within a system that is broadly accommodating to right-wing extremism, given that all they really want to do is let the unfettered free market dominate and then also oppress minorities minorities on the edges, which doesn't really hurt the bottom line of businesses. So that's why it's way more important for us to keep right-wing extremists out of power than it is for us to let left-wing extremists get into power marginally more often. I'll take a POI from back half. Go. Oh, come on. All right, POI from top half.
Yeah, so if the argument is that like right-wing politicians tend to be more willing to use like dirty tactics to try to stay in power, isn't it also true that they probably are more likely in your world to weaponize smear tactics, which means they probably don't get crowded out as much as left-wing politicians?
Okay, bro, sorry. Right-wing extremists, I promise this is symmetric. They are going to call Joe Biden a crooked, communist, evil demon on both sides of the house, as they do in the status quo. They are not going to sort of moderate and being nice to the liberals on your side. Come on, I think this is patently untrue. Just look at the status quo. CG will deal with that as well. All right, let's talk rebuilding. So first on the principle. As Ethan explained to you, this really matters for a lot of reasons, but perhaps the simplest is just the state power principle. Governments have an enormous amount of power over our lives. They have a monopoly on the use of violence. They control our lives in a wide range of ways, controlling where we eat, where we work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Given that they have so much power over us, they have a reciprocal obligation to give us power over them. So why that matters for this motion, I'm not just running the stock argument, is that governments have an obligation to maximize voters' capacity to have their interests and their values and their preferences be expressed in the makeup of the government, in the people who write the laws, in all the institutions that are downstream from the elected politicians. And so insofar as we show that there's tons and tons of voters who have really strong legitimate preferences, which is to say hatred for one party and honestly in many cases disdain for all the other parties, and that the status quo doesn't allow them to actualize that preference, there is a huge principled gap. We are living in a not fully democratic system. The only real response to this that we get is, well, now some edge case politicians aren't going to run. And like, sure, but our point is that what we are allowing to happen is for the wishes of more of the voter base to be, or more of the citizenry to be expressed in the government. Yeah, we're going to lose the ability for some far leftists and some far rightists to have their voice be heard. But we're saying is that for the majority, we now get their voices more expressed in terms of the makeup of the government. And we get tons more voter turnout for people who otherwise just wouldn't show up to elections at all. And so that has all the downstream benefits that Ethan outlined to you in terms of having governments be more representative of what citizens want in aggregate. Next, let's talk about a point on moderation. So we explained to you why this in the status quo, parties will realize that, oh, maybe they have enough positive votes to win and the opposition's fractured, so they don't even have to reach out for the other side, so they can do a base first strategy, yada, yada, yada. I want to first illustrate this point just to make it crystal clear and not let any other team strawman it. Imagine you're a right-wing party and you aren't an extreme right-wing party. And so you're in an election where, let's say there's like 2 left-wing alternatives, maybe even a fringe left-wing alternative as well. What you're going to do now is you're going to moderate to avoid lefties negative voting you. What you want these lefties to do is either stay home because they don't hate anyone enough to negative vote and they hate everyone else similarly, or you want them to vote for a fringe party that has no real chance of success. So if you allow negative voting, now you're scared of these people going directly harming you rather than doing these other things that don't really directly harm you. So you're going to moderate to not be as off-putting because you're not going to want to be so hateable that there's a large number of people who negative vote you. That's why you moderate, and so that's why all the weighing follows. The responses they get also really shallow. The first is there's impeachment, there's term limits, and also the claim that no one's voting for Trump anymore, guys. I don't know if you've seen the polls. Trump is very much a contender to win the next election. Right-wing populism is on the rise all around the world. This is an active threat. They say, well, bad extremists just won't get voted in. No, look at the news. Look at Jair Bolsonaro. Look at Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. Right-wing extremists are on the rise all across the world. By far the most important thing in this debate is to reduce the extent to which they get in power and do all the fucked up shit that they do once they get there. For all those reasons, so proud to propose. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech and welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
All right, can you hear me? Perfect. All right. I am going to start my speech. I'll take POIs in the chat, preferably around 5 minutes from closing. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. There will be 4 things I do in this speech. The first one is proving a key burden on opposition as to why people change how they vote. I will then talk about the government case a little bit, talk about radical politicians, and finish with some weighing on our pushes. First, why do people fundamentally change how they vote in Gov's world? I think Justin already told you this happens for identity politics. Here's what that means. Consider how your mentality will change when you have the option to negative vote. The question you ask yourself, panel, is now not who do I want to be in office, but rather who do I not want to be in office. This naturally changes what people weight in terms of their decision decisions, right? I now overweight negative aspects over policies I might support. For example, a racist voter who supports liberal financial policy. In status quo, he might have voted for Obama because he supports his financial policy over conservative alternatives and he cares about policy first and foremost because he's voting for something positive. However, now that he has a negative vote, the connotation changes. He might change what he prioritizes. His bias, now probably against Obama, takes precedence because it's now a vote against Obama rather than a vote for policies he doesn't like. This is the mental reframing that a lot of voters are going to do, panel, because I think on intuition, when they start looking at this, the perception shift is pretty obvious. It makes them vote for their biases a lot more often. It makes it easier for them to frame voting for their biases as voting against somebody rather than voting for somebody. This semantic thing is important because I think this means that it's far worse for education and how people engage in politics. The way people educate themselves now for who to vote is not just who they have to support constructively, but who is the worst possible option. And because of this, they're often influenced by the media smear campaigns that Justin tells you. I'll deal with that later as to why that's uniquely a harm, but I think the point here is simple. This negatively hurts those who already face discrimination and bias. People who are trying to forward Black rights movements, for example, people who are members of minority groups. These people face far more bias, far more opposition on the populist level, and this makes it easier for people to act upon these populist incentives when they otherwise would have acted on other incentives. This is the tipping point for getting less support. Let's talk real quick about the Gov push, which is basically about people with strong political views who now don't have options and how they opt out of the voting, the representation thing. I think this might be true, but I don't think so for three main reasons. The first one is there probably exist incentives to cater to people's views organically, i.e. you want their vote. So parties that have no representative option are probably already a relatively small minority because politicians know how to optimize the vote and say, hey, there's a meaningful voting bloc who has views that I should support so I can get their votes. The incentive to get their votes actually lowers in Gov's counterfactual because my options are now to either get their vote or to convince them to vote against somebody else. So I think you probably get less representation in general. I think the second reason this holds true is because policy shifts in terms of how people actually structure policy. This is the concession we get from government, that there is a race to the middle, that we stop getting outspoken policies that might support certain groups' interests because people don't want the negative votes that come with them. This naturally means that those who are already underrepresented get even fewer options and are getting more left out because people are no longer willing to champion those outspoken frames when there are far more moderate frames that can get them far more support. The issue is the same that government points out. On either side of the house, some group of people probably don't get to vote for what they want and don't have politicians forcing the things that they want to vote for. One last thing then on available information, because we tell you that the types of information provided shift. What does this mean? I think it means it's just now far more likely for a politician to give you like some smear campaign about how someone else is doing something negative than focus on what he's doing positively, because the buy-in to someone else being negative is far more universal than whatever policies I'm trying to push for myself. This necessarily means the type of discourse we get, the type of information available to people naturally shifts, which I think defeats their point on more informed voting because one, you get less good policies, but two, less informed voting upon them. Real quick then on radical politicians, because OG tells me this is certainly a good thing that I'm curtailing radical voices. I'm not really so sure, panel, because I think that you actually force out really progressive politicians far more often than you force out populist far-right politicians. There are two main reasons for this. The first is that the people who are far-right and populist cater to majority biases. This looks like Donald Trump, who has a group of people who are racist and will follow him no matter what he says, right? He has a far more certain voting bloc, which means he's far more likely to act upon that and far more likely to not be worried about smear campaigns because they're going to exist more symmetrically to them. I also think that when you force them out of the mainstream, you probably just make them take darker alternatives to appeal in the first place, which is probably not that great and probably leads to more fringe activism and extremism on their side. But secondly, I think they have lower barriers for engaging in smear campaigns and weaponizing bias in the first place because there already exist societal biases to weaponize against minority groups, to weaponize against the far left that are far more prevalent. This means smear campaigns have far higher efficacy when they come from far right politicians than far left politicians because the people they're trying to sway are actively swayed by these smear campaigns. This means it cuts far worse against progressives. Why is it then so bad? And why do we need radical progressive people in office? I think there are three main reasons that Gov misses. The first one is you probably just get better social change because at the point in which you get some of these people into office to push forth their policy within Congress, this is probably a good thing for us in terms of actually getting representation for the groups Gov wants. But secondly, it's about shifting the Overton window because even if it's the case that Bernie Sanders policies never get passed, the existence of Bernie Sanders as a prominent political icon mean that more moderate leftist people have more chances to get their things passed because there's far less opposition to them because people are busy opposing the most radical point of view. This means that a shift in the Overton window probably allows for more progressive policy on net to be passed, something they lose out on. Finally, I think just in terms of representation for minority groups, it gets worse on their side of the house because the politicians who tend to be cut out, like I've shown you, tend to be the ones who champion minority rights, tend to be the ones who champion the rights of the few rather than that of the many. I'll take a quick OG POI. No, sorry, CG.
Yeah, I think when negative votes exist, parties can't coast off being the lesser of two evils because they don't pick up any
Yep.
votes if a bunch of people follow that rhetoric and
This
vote
is
against the
perfect.
other party.
That's perfect. I'm getting to that right now because the gut push here on change behaviors is that you still need people to like you, right? So you're still going to focus on positive things. Here's the issue with that argument, panel. You already have a dedicated voter block who will vote for you no matter what, especially true if you're an extremist far-right group. Now, you have two options with what to do with your ad money, panel. You can either try to sway or poach other voters and moderates who don't intrinsically agree with you and have no right or going to agree with you, or you can take all that money and make these moderates hate somebody else instead and cut their votes. Which one are these people going to opt for? I think it's quite clear they're opting for the second one because they have a higher chance of success, because it's far easier to get someone to hate somebody else and play upon their biases and play upon the information you can feed them than it is to get them to love you when they have fundamentally different views than yourself. This is exactly why this is a tipping point to smear campaigns, because now the marginal utility of running a smear campaign is far, far higher because I can weaponize other voters against other people far more efficiently than I can swing them to my side. This is why the intensity of smear campaigns gets far worse on government side and ruins their benefits to minority groups. Let's weigh this. I think first on smear campaigns and negative media, I think I've proven why it's the tipping point, right? In that case, one, this probably devalues political discourse and that you just don't get as much policy being talked about. But secondly, and more importantly, this causes centrism, right? It causes a race to the median. Government seems so eager to accept this as a good thing, but I'm not so sure, because when you run to the median, who gets hurt? It's the minority voices who need policy to support them, but the vast majority of people don't support. These are the people you're crowding out, panel. These are the people whose policies never even show up in Congress because they're so worried about running for president next year that they never push it. For this in mind, I think that the political campaign that government creates, political ideology, even with all their best case, is one where you get little long-lasting political change because everyone is so damn sure to be centrist. With this in mind, vote opposition.
I would like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that fine speech and welcome the Member of Government to open back half. You're here.
PYs in chat. I think, unfortunately, opening government relies too much on the principle. We're going to explain on CG why you get policy implementation of people's preferences, because even if you vote for a party who never does anything that's related to the reason you voted for them, doesn't really manifest the principle of democracy because you're not being represented, like maybe you are technically, but doesn't really mean anything if they're not doing anything that was related to why you voted for them in the first place. First, let's flip opening opposition's most compelling argument, which is that negative smear campaigns are going to get increased. I think that this works exactly the opposite. Like I explained in POI, parties lose the ability to be the plausible alternative towards the hated party they're running a smear campaign on. The issue with how opening opposition frames a lot of engagement here is that they assume that if you vote against the other party, that still benefits the most plausible alternative. In a two-party system, none of this debate really matters because a vote against the Republicans is directly exchangeable for a vote for the Democrats. But that's not true in a multi-party democracy like in many other places in the world. Because, say, the Canadian Liberals can coast off being better than the Canadian Conservatives, that means they can run smear campaigns on one another, which means that both of them kind of benefit as people at further fringes in sort of libertarian and other right-wing politics and the analogous on the left go into their camp so that they can engage in big tent politics. Here's why this doesn't work. When you're running smear campaigns, all of the people who were voting for you just because they hate the libs now vote against the libs, but not for moderate conservatives, right? And the same's true on the other side. All of those votes were never votes positively for things you offered or ideas you had. So there are still people who are going to vote for, say, third parties like the Greens or the NDP or other analogous parties in Europe that I don't have names for because I can't think of them. But point is, those parties probably win because all of the negative votes do successfully crush like the conservatives or the libs who you hate. And now people proposing real policies that people vote positively for pick up that additional support and now have the ability to form coalitions or even win elections outright because it turns out people didn't like a lot of these big tent parties in the first place. Let's I think that effectively flips opening opposition's key arguments, so we're probably taking it over them at that point. Let's get into why we think we get better functioning democracy. I think, first of all, a lot of I guess that's actually the same point I just made. I guess I'll take the POI from OO next. Yeah, go ahead.
Even if there are multiple parties, everyone has one vote, so you still wash out the independent and Greens of the world.
I don't think that's true, because the problem is a lot of people aren't going to negatively vote for parties that just propose like fringe policy suggestions. I think there are a lot of relatively uncontroversial things most people are not going to have a strong enough opinion on to vote negatively for. Say something like just broadly supporting the economy or supporting families, or I know in America this is controversial, but like getting climate change stuff, like most people don't really have strong negative views of this and aren't likely to vote for this. Obviously, some things like social rights are going to be a lot more like, you know, immigrants are going to have much more sort of political baggage and might see people vote negatively on. That's a bit unfortunate, but I do think there are lots of sensible parties that are going to pick up substantial support on our side of the house, and that's probably good. Second sort of idea, I think in a lot of instances, there are the ability for in coalition type systems fringe parties to sort of play kingmaker, because for instance likely in the upcoming election in Spain, the sort of moderate right-wing conservatives will win enough support not to form government, but can do so if they form a coalition with the sort of fringe far-right party, and so this affords lots of power to parties who have small elements of sort of electoral support, but are able to then be kingmaker and form a coalition with a larger tent party, and gives them undue power. I think that ironically, even though some people do support those parties, this ability for them to use small levels of political support overly sort of gives undue power to extremists and is probably really, really bad for reasons other people have already explained. But as well, we think that in many instances, minorities can band together to negatively vote as blocks. So say, for instance, if a bunch of people are really, really concerned about, say, the pullback of abortion rights or LGBT rights in their country, they can bring people out and I think effectively get out the vote in a negative way, because a lot of the reason many people feel disenfranchised is because they don't like the idea of voting for somebody who takes their support for granted, who isn't actually going to do anything for them, is just not going to continue hurting them. And so I think in these instances, a lot of people are happy to say, you know, get out to vote to fuck over Marie Le Pen or something, but they aren't comfortable voting for Macron. And so in these instances, this helps you get out the vote in a way that we think is really, really productive. I think bottom line, what have we accomplished on closing government? I think our flip of opening up opposition's main contribution, explaining how it's much more likely that policies get implemented that authentically support people's sort of democratic will, allows us to better actualize all of opening government's somewhat vague principle, where, you know, they say it's important for people to have their democratic rights represented, but that's only true if those rights get actualized. By showing how on the sort of large scale, parties can't coast off of being big tent and off of smear campaigns, this means that they're much more likely to try and woo voters with things that most people can get behind, things that improve their well-being, improve the well-being of their families, improve the sort of future of their country, and get voters excited, that make them want to go out, go to the polls, get hyped about what these people are bringing to the table. That means that people's will, all the beautiful principles of democracy actually happen, things get passed, and those people see something, and then that fulfills the principle from opening government. So we think we take it above them for that reason. And obviously, we're beating opening opposition because we flipped their case. We have to beat them. So yeah, to propose.
I would like to thank the Member of Government for that fine speech, and now welcome the Member of Opposition to bring in closing opposition. Here, here.
Okay, POI's in chat. It should be good. And just give me a sec here. Okay, I totally fell asleep through most of prep time, but I'm gonna do the sneaky thing and try to like steal most of opening's case here and explain why concessions and watering down is probably going to be fully asymmetric in terms of right wing versus left wing sort of ways that it happens. And then I'm going to talk about mandates and contend with most of the gov case and explain why you probably don't actually get true forms of representation and legitimacy on their side. So first, in terms of in worlds without negative voting, citizens are probably encouraged to vote for parties that they bring positive change and progress. I think that that's the point where the debate like sort of reaches, right? I think that the focus on then developing constructive policies and effective leadership to attract voters versus like shifting the focus towards avoiding negative attractions rather than earning support probably leads to less productive democratic environments, right? And this is then where CG comes in and they explain how, well, it's probably likely that to some extent you'll probably want to avoid these sorts of things too, but also to some extent like feel represented and still develop like some degree of productive sort of like policy, right? I think at the point at which you're in a world where policies aren't watered down at all, though, to appease negative votes, but you probably have more political freedom to present things like that are more robust and well defined, that encourages things like active, like open and transparent debate. When you have things like discussions and debates for like visions of the future, allowing voters to then actively have to like attend these sorts of conversations to make informed decisions based on the merits of these policies, rather than based on disagreeing with some base level like ideology, rather than disagreeing with some like with like initial perceptions of your party, right? Because if they need to positively vote, they need to actively do things like that, like discuss and like see different sort of like visions of that, right? But why then do concessions probably mean that you water down asymmetrically in terms of left wing versus right wing ways, right? You probably, one, erode the incentives for voters to cast positive votes for parties that they genuinely support to some extent, right? What that means then is you probably have skewed and unbalanced sort of representation, as you can probably win then by avoiding a large degree of negative sentiment rather than earning positive support, right? But why does this happen in a bad way? Because if negative voting is allowed, people probably have to water down their policies to some extent to provoke like strong, or to not provoke these strong negative sentiments, right? And that leads to a lack of direction in governments and all like the harms that come from that middle of road approach, which is generally just that like one, citizens just become disillusioned by this, feeling that their options are probably much more limited and that real change isn't possible. But two, the watering down is also asymmetrical. And here's why this is the case, right? And this will also engage with a lot of Nick's analysis, explaining why right-wing extremism doesn't necessarily fall out symmetrically with the watering down, right? I think there are several reasons for this. First, ideological cohesion among right-wing parties, right? What this looks like is then that right-wing ideologies will probably tend to have much more straightforward and consistent principles like limited government intervention, individualism, and traditional values. These ideological like cohesion are probably just a lot more unified and cohesive, right? Second, top-down hierarchical structures, right? Right-wing parties probably have much more hierarchical like organization structures with clear chains of command and centralized decision-making. What that then looks like is more coordination and unified approach to things like policies and messaging. Second, the third thing then in terms of nationalism and identity, they probably emphasize national identity and pride, which creates much more solidarity among their supporters. Fourth is general opposition to change. When you're advocating for maintaining status quo or rolling back certain changes, this probably just creates a shared resistance to progressive policies, right? But notice that the negative vote here is particularly crucial, right? Because a negative vote probably means a lack of like wanting to introduce certain policies, right? I don't think you're negative voting like certain policies out of like things, right, that have already passed, right? What that then means is that based on like whatever mandate theory that we get, the negative vote is much more likely to be used in that right-wing sense, insofar as like you are much more likely to favor status quo, not wanting certain changes, which means that you probably like, and the way that the media probably influences that means that you promote these sorts of narratives in the first place, reinforcing that sense of unity among right-wing voters, right? Here's why left-wing unity is probably challenged then, and why you probably have to resort to a significantly greater degree of like watering down or appeasing to like majoritarian like ideals, which means that you probably have to lose out on progressivism, right? First, you probably have a much more diverse ideological spectrum when you're with like with a bigger range of ideologies. When it comes to like left-wing sort of parties and policies within general. And I think that leads to just general sort of factioning and like things that are much more likely to happen among the left wing, right? Second, there's just a greater emphasis on things like inclusivity, because you have to prioritize these sorts of things when you talk about like representation of marginalized groups, which then lead to different sort of like ideologies as well, right? Third, the left wing is much more reliant on things like grassroots activism, right? Because you have a strong tradition of these sorts of things that are much more decentralized and represent those that don't feel like that do feel disillusioned completely like by the political system, right? Fourth, just general like intersectionality stuff, right? I think the left wing movements often often acknowledge like these sorts of aspects of social issues, which leads to much more nuanced and multifaceted like approaches to a lot of these decision making, right? I think then when it comes to like decision making, you're probably the risk aversion that you're likely to have means that broadly speaking, progressivism is hurt much more because negative voting means that they particularly have to adopt the more risk-averse strategy, not the conservative ones, right? I'll take a POI from OG.
Speculation about who wins and who loses aside, at PM we give you a number of reasons to believe that many more people who currently do not vote now would vote, which means that every impact about representation, about who's about policy and everything like that is dependent on more people coming out to vote and more politicians actually acting on what the public believes, which we prove at OG and no one else is meaningfully engaged with.
Okay, cool. I'll deal with mandate theory right now. So basically the idea is that like, okay, well, your political party will campaign for X, Y, and Z, and you generally will support maybe like X and Y, not Z, and you don't feel completely involved in this party. So you feel disillusioned, and now the negative vote gives you some unique opportunity window, right? I think that this legitimacy doesn't necessarily come from like feeling like you're represented within that system, but rather like the majority of positive vote that then undermines like the ideology or ideals that that explain which party got into power, right? Most people probably don't check out the thousands of pages of documents when it comes to like voting, like policy proposals and stuff. Rather, they generally vote based on like a broad sort of philosophy and ideal that then underpins a lot of like the developments and like mandates that you have, right? That's why it is like justified in a democracy for a party to make spontaneous policy proposals based on events that occur, because the underlying philosophy that you're voting on is probably just then much more prevalent, and that the majority generally supports to a greater extent, right? With negative voting, you lose that ability to be representative of these base ideals when passing whatever policies, especially ones that don't mandate your support, insofar as insofar as you can have like literal majorities that are still against like the base ideology or the base level of policies that you're proposing, and they prefer like maybe X to Y, but Y is passing because you have super passionate negative votes that then screw the majority. So by mandate theory, the negative votes do lead to less representation. Proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the member of opposition for that fine speech, and welcome, Gov. Here.
Excellent. Okay. The abstract concept of representation does not matter at the point at which people aren't getting policy that represents them. The purpose of democracy is translating preferences into policies that affect people. If I can vote and more people vote, that is irrelevant insofar as what I vote for doesn't get seen, or I don't feel like I have a government that represents me. This round ought to be weighed on practical policy preferences are being manifested, and CG is the case that gives you the best characterization. First, let's give you very clearly what we get from CG, and then I'll weigh it against every other team, telling why we're the team that wins this debate. First, I think it's really important to note that when you negatively vote against one party. So all of OG's, which means you're only going to negatively vote against the parties that you see as a threat. I'm not going to negatively vote a small liberal green party. I'm not going to vote like the regional Welsh party. I'm only going to vote against parties that I view as an active threat to myself as a voter. What are the implications on this on a round? One, moderates have an obligation to pose positive policy. The reason for this, as Diggory said, is that the parties which are likely to be voted against are the parties which are likely to win an election. I might vote against the CDU in Germany, but I'm not going to vote against the small Bavarian regional party because I see the CDU as affecting my life and representing my issues, but not a regional party that is not relevant or I don't even know those policies, which means moderates are most affected because they're the parties that have the widest base and are seen as the biggest risk in terms of elections, which means then when moderates lose votes for negative parties, they are forced to adopt positive pragmatic policy to win over voters and say that I win, you should vote for me for XYZ reasons. The reason this doesn't happen in status quo is because parties are able to ride the coattails of, if you don't vote for us because we're the only electable party, the evil guys win, right? A lot of people in Germany don't like the SDP or even the CDU, but they hate and are afraid of the AfD. So what you do is you vote for these parties on the basis that you fear the other party winning. And so parties, especially moderates, because their only pitch is I'm the electable party, don't need to actually put over positive policy. They just say we are better than the other guys. We won't do the bad things, but that's not equivalent to saying we will do the good things. What happens on the flip, because you're losing votes to attrition to better parties, is you have to offer positive policy, which gets voters engaged, but also notably, weighing against OG, gives you pragmatic policy, which actually represents these preferences. People can vote for the German Socialist Party or whatever it is, the party that's currently in power with Olaf Scholz. I don't know European politics, right? Insofar as you can vote for that party, right? Insofar as they're not actually doing anything or not offering positive policy, you don't get changes. This is the problem with British politics. This is the problem with American politics. Large, quote, moderate parties don't do anything. And the reason they don't do anything, and this is going to engage directly with CO, is because when you don't do anything, when you do stuff, you alienate other voters, right? At the point at which you put your hat behind a specific policy, at the point at which the Labour says, we want to increase funding for the NHS, or we want to increase immigration, putting your hat between a specific policy alienates you from potential other voters. So parties in status quo want to do that as little as possible, as for all the reasons that OO says. When you stand behind specific policy, that is a potential risk. It risks to alienate specific voters. In status quo, they don't need to do that. They take the only negative approach because they say we're not the worst, but at the point at which you now have no avenue to winning by just not being the worst party, you actually have to put tangible policy and potentially risk alienating some people, but you have no other path to victory because people will just negative vote against you because you don't stand for anything. This is the most important impact in the round because we tell you that parties actually adopt specific policy. 2, parties making kingmakers. We tell you that A, this round is not relevant to two-party democracies because there's no actual margin. This is happening in parties where coalitions happen and small parties can make major differences. How then does this actually manifest in a specific context? 1, right-wing extremist parties engaging with the entire of the op case are going to get the majority of negative votes, and that is because they are viewed as the biggest threat in elections. People are afraid of the AfD. People are afraid of parties which are super hostile and target LGBT rights or immigration rights. So even if these parties are small, they're likely to vote against them and prevent them from coming into power. So these people will be negative voted against. The small other liberal parties won't get negative votes. No one fucking sees the Welsh Party in England as a threat. No one's afraid that the Welsh Party is going to curb LGBT rights, and so no one's going to negative vote against them. You only negative vote against parties which you see as a threat. Why then do we give more power to non-extremist left-wing parties which maximize preferences? What we tell you is, A, in status quo, a lot of people who support smaller parties don't vote for them because they're afraid of the worst party winning. At the point at which a negative vote ensures that the worst party isn't going to get to power, people feel more free in terms of decision making and are more likely to vote for these parties in the first place. 2, the analysis that Diggory gives you, right? Parties, if they don't actually pass positive policy that people care about, these large moderate parties are going to attrition voters, which gives emboldened smaller parties like the Greens or the regional interest parties, which means they actually gain greater support. What is the impact? When these parties act as kingmakers in politics, they're more likely to actually push for policy and get specific special interest group interests being represented in policy, which never happens on the alternative because these parties can't build large enough coalition blocks when everyone is so afraid of the moderate right-wing party or the extreme right-wing party winning, so they only vote for the large left-wing party that doesn't actually stand for anything. We're more likely to get the representation of niche progressive interest votes in this debate. Sure, OO.
At the point in which you never get Bernie Sanders or AOC running for anything, if you never get liberal ideas, the ones that we now consider as far right.
Yeah, so I literally just dealt with that, right? I literally told you why small left-wing interest groups, A, aren't inflammatory enough to alienate people, unlike right-wing extremist groups, and these will get into coalition governments. We're talking about context with multi-party democracies because two-party democracies aren't relevant, which means we actually do get the avenue for left-wing representation. But 2, because large moderate parties have to mobilize left-wing voters to vote for them, they're more likely to offer things like healthcare for all, which means you're actually more likely to get Bernie Sanders running in order to mobilize behind positive policy. Okay, let's weigh against every other team. OG says we reduce right-wing extremists and have a vague principle. We actually impact their principle. I told you that their principle is irrelevant insofar as they don't actually get tangible policy which represents people or democracies and coalitions which represent people's interests, right? Even if 1 million people more vote, if their never votes don't actually mean anything, then that doesn't matter. But 2, voter apathy increases at the point at which people don't see policy which represents them, which means maybe if they're one election cycle, voter turnout decreases because no one's voting in the first place. Right-wing extremist stuff, we actually impact, tell you uniquely the impact of right-wingers on policy, but specifically why non-extremist parties will actually have impacts on policy and when we get tangible policy in the debate. 2, we flip their mech entirely, right? We tell you why we actually do get more tangible policy, why large parties, but also smart parties are actually going to fight for things, why they actually have more of an incentive to be positive, and why we actually flip it back so we outweigh OO. CO, I think, is largely derivative, but let's deal with them specifically. Their case about watering down is a status quo incentive because you don't want to alienate voters. I already sold this. At the point at which being mid means that you don't get any positive votes, you can't win elections, you're less likely to take that as strategy. Also, we tell you coalitions are likely to get diverse perspective anyway, so we still win on that metric. So proud to propose.
I would like to thank the government whip for that fine speech and welcome the opposition whip. Hear, hear.
I'll take POIs verbally. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Speaker, if the only way that we can mobilize voters is by saying you can now choose your least favorite party, those voters are mobilized by fear. We think currently there's only one side of the political spectrum that rides on rhetorical and fearful narratives to perform well. Nimai tells you why this policy is going to be incredibly harmful for weaponizing conservative rhetoric in the short term and also leads to a more skewed political system in the long run. I'll be doing a team-by-team whip, starting off with opening government. The first thing that they tell us under the principle, which is the more information people share about parties, the more accountable government is that people are going to do things like proxy or strategic voting. We think this happens more on government side of the house. If you realize that there's 2 parties at the top, you're going to negative vote the one that is your party's biggest competition. And strategic voting positively also doesn't go away. So if there's 3 parties in your favor, one won't win, you're still likely to vote strategically. I think the harms to this means that you're never able to actually express your desires for the government. They're not doing the policy work that they sought to represent, and you're most likely unable to be you're going to be unable to fix this because there's no guarantee that there's going to be policy outcomes for like coming from this. Beyond front half, talking about just like more ad hominem or like smear campaigns, I think even genuinely well-intentioned parties are more likely to spend time dissecting the policies of their greatest opposition. But the most pressing thing here is that most of the world is bicameral, like you get 2 houses and a parliament, and you get very rare majorities in both houses. So as a party, your path to victory is to strategically aim for splitting seats most times, and that's something that's incredibly harmful for representation. If there's a point, I'll take it.
Here's why rightist parties moderate more than leftists. Being a right-wing politician is a path to big money, so right-wing parties attract unscrupulous power seekers who will say anything to get in power. By contrast, being a left-wing politician doesn't get you big money, so it mainly attracts people who strongly care about their beliefs, so they won't compromise on their position. See Bernie Sanders.
Okay, rap god. I think we have a lot of like refutation to that, which is namely that the specific types of ways that parties convince voters to vote for them is different. So regardless of your personal incentives as a politician, I think you have the incentive to use the strategy that's most successful for you to get into power. And historically and currently for right-wing parties, it's been using more rhetoric. It's been having more unity than the left. And on the left, you unfortunately fall victim to a lot of those tactics on the right, but they become significantly worse once negative votes are allowed and the right is able to weaponize those strategies against you. The next thing that they tell you is that extremist parties are going to be less extreme and try to cater to everyone. I think sure, there might be concessions on both sides, but we think the concessions are still going to unfairly skew right. For example, the identity politics that our front half mentions are uniquely weaponized by right-wing parties to gain supporters that wouldn't otherwise benefit from their policies. For example, in America, they often say that they're good for the working class because they lower taxes and let people pull themselves up from their bootstraps, while left-wing parties are going to say advocate for a better welfare state. In many of these cases, the policy that actually benefits the poor happens on the left, striving for economic equality, but the left has weaker rhetoric that doesn't evoke feelings of nationalism, feelings of populism. When the negative vote exists, the right-wing like contention is going to say things like the left is woke, brainwashed, anti-American, many of which are personal, visceral threats that evoke feelings of fear rather than support. So thinking about this realistically, many right-wing platforms do base themselves on fear and less real policy, and this negative advocacy becomes very powerful once you lift the negative voting restriction. Why do I take it over our front half? They tell us that we're going to have a focus towards smear campaigns, mental shifts. More radical parties aren't going to come vote because they'll be like downvoted. There's going to be a shift towards centrism. We don't think the biggest problem comes out of opening opposition's case. That is to say, even if people tend to be more negative and more centrist, if that's generally the representation of their beliefs, then that's probably okay. But we think structurally, the system is likely to weaponize the harms to democracy that overrepresent one party over another because of the type of ways that voters are swayed to not look at the policies anymore, but rather towards like fear-mongering rhetoric and taking like the fact that like on the left, you have more parties that tend to band together. So we think this is something that's actually like structurally harmful. Why do we take it over back half then? The biggest thing that they tell us is that like it's better to take out, okay, wait, actually one last point from opening government. They tell you that it's better to take out right-wing extremists than to include left-wing extremists because right-wing parties are anti-democratic and don't face roadblocks. I think this motion like uniquely mobilizes those types of parties because in a world where they're forced to cater to the broader majority, or there's that perceived fear of having to do that, they're more likely to scapegoat the policy and weaponize more conservative beliefs in the political sphere. That is to say, believing that the government is using this policy to erase conservative thought whenever they see in the polls that they're getting a lot of negative votes, for example. The biggest problem that's faced by a lot of very right groups right now isn't that they're like winning, but it's often that they're not winning and claim to win anyways, or base their platforms on claims of injustice that are a problem of democracy itself. When you change the voting system, you probably fall more into these conspiracies. You become more likely to say the government is taking away conservative votes or erasing right-wing representation. And this means in the political atmosphere, things become worse. For example, independent conservative activist organizations, worse sentiments on social media. But we actually think that this is like all in the best case where they do receive negative votes. In the worst case, they'll actually have a better chance to get elected. Back half tells you that moderates are forced to adopt policies because they can no longer rely on being the best alternative. I think the link that isn't clear here is why losing votes means you're going to have policies. It's probably perfectly convincing to some average voters to not have strict policies, but to bank on the fact that other parties are going to be worse than yours. And I also think that this is something that's skewed depending on the political alignment. If you're the only electable Liberal Party, then you do face a huge risk of being negative voted by all of the conservative people. Even if you do step up and make policies, you're more likely to suffer from the collectivized downvotes. But if you're the only electable conservative party, you can probably get by mobilizing those anti-establishment narratives and galvanizing conservatives to vote for your side. We think that's something that like has harms and unequally harms like the different parties, but also there's no specific guarantee that they're going to adopt more concrete policies to get positive support when the negative vote does exist and when it's something that seems to be more proximate to people based on how like the political system looks right now. For these reasons then, I think my partner's case is the most important in this round and is able to prove why we get a less fair and less representative democratic system because of the overrepresentation of the right. For these reasons, really proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the opposition for that fine speech and everyone for what was a very engaging debate.